Hi, I'm Nicholas Kaiser, chef and owner of Rooted Craft Kitchen in Del Mar Coastal Cuisine. Today we're going to be making a little Valentine's Day pot pie that you can share with your loved ones at home for the upcoming Valentine's Day celebration. We're using organic spinach, artichokes, and lump crab meat to make a little bit more of a delicate pot pie that you can easily assemble at home in 20 or 30 minutes. All right, so to start, we have all of our ingredients here. It's very important to get everything ready to go before you start cooking. Facilitates the cooking process and makes sure that we don't lose any steps throughout the way. Although this is easy, it's always good to have your mise en place in front of you. So as you can see, the ingredients that we've put together today, we did buy the puff pastry. The Dufour is an award-winning French pastry that we like to use. It fluffs up a little bit better than most and has just really nice French sweet butter to give a nice crust to the end. For the first section that we're using we're going to put together the base of the pot pie itself. We're going to start with some frozen chopped spinach. It is an organic frozen chopped spinach, but in this instance, you do want to use something that you can extrude all the water out of without adding anything else in there. So rather than using 10 pounds of spinach and having to go through and chop everything, there's definitely some good frozen organic products at your local grocery store. And in this instance, we want to take a pound of spinach and kind of just put it into a colander. Over the sink, you're going to press and make sure that all the water comes out of there. We just don't want this to color the pot pies to a green after we get finished with all the chlorophyll. We also don't want to lose some of the water content after we build the roux. We're going to be making flour and butter mixture with almost like a cheese sauce and cream filling. So if you add any of the water content to it, it might tend to get a little loose when you're eating it and not give the final product that we're looking for. So make sure that when you strain this comes out to almost dry. As you can see, I'm pressing on that. We're still getting a little residual liquid, but ultimately we want it to be as dry as possible for the finished product. Next, we're going to use some artichokes. There's some really, really good marinated in olive oil if you want to kind of gravitate towards an herbed olive oil marinated artichoke. It's going to tend to add some flavor to the end of it as well without having to add any dried spices. With these, we just kind of want to fortify our mixture and add this to the spinach. Typically they're going to come small, they're going to be very clean, but we just want it to be manageable for a fork because when eating pot pies you aren't going to be using any knives or anything like that. We want this to be as easy as possible to be able to serve. So we'll cut these down. Some of them are bigger than others, of course, but typically we're just going to kind of get 1/6 or quarters of all of these artichokes. So again, we can eat it with a fork as we kind of cut into the pot pie later. So now we have the spinach, we have the artichokes, and now we're going to add the crab. So in this instance, we're going to be using a special lump crab, which is it's a white meat crab claw that's shredded down a little bit more than some of the jumbo lumps that you're going to get. It's definitely manageable in price too. This is a great option for this. Again, we're trying to get everything easily manageable when it's in that souffle dish later. You don't want to have a full slate of fork and knife and spoon and everything. We want this to be a little bit more homogeneous. So we're actually just going to use a 1/2 pound in this recipe. You will get a recipe later for everything in detail, which will make 6 souffle cups and pot pies. We're only going to go for 4 right now. But now we have everything ready to go for our filling. We have spinach, we have the artichokes, and we have about a 1/2 pound of the super lump crab meat. So now that we have the mix made for the pot pies themselves with crab and spinach and artichoke, we're going to start with the base itself. In this phase, we're going to be making the roux and then finishing it with milk to make kind of more of a cream sauce base, and then folding in Gruyere cheese to make a mornay that's going to be the base behind the crab and the artichokes and the spinach to have a nice creamy pot pie when we get finished. So in this instance, we have a 1/2 pound of butter, which is 1 cup of butter for those of you using sticks at home. We want to bring it up to a heavy simmer on the stovetop, and we're going to be adding in flour. There's 3 different stages of roux. one being blonde, brown, and a dark roux. Different uses for different things. As you continue to cook the flour, it's going to get a little bit more substantial, a little bit more nutty in smell and flavor. In this instance, we're just going to use a blonde roux because we want to remain the color very light white, and we don't want too much flavor kind of inhibiting the fragile nature of the crab and the artichokes themselves. So we have our butter that's up to a simmer here on the stove, and we're going to be adding the flour in and continuously whisking until we kind of cook the rawness out. I know that's kind of a loose term, but we throw that around kitchens a lot. You kind of taste the rawness and you taste the kind of graininess of the flour. If you really tasted it raw, which I don't suggest doing if you haven't. But as you cook it, it continuously gets a little bit more cooked and buttery. Obviously, we're cooking it in butter, but a little bit more rich to kind of finish the final product. So we're going to add the flour in here. Add my whisk. Equal parts essentially, so 1 cup of butter to 1 cup of flour, and we're just going to add it into the top. You're going to see it simmer a little bit. At this point, we're going to turn the heat down from what was about a medium high, just to about a medium, so we don't burn any of the flour. This is important to keep stirring this for a couple different reasons. Flour and butter together, if you've ever baked, burns quite quickly, so we don't want to keep anything in one central area on the bottom of the pan for too long, and we also don't want it to clump up. If you let these kind of develop the lumps, you're going to have that, and it's very, very difficult to break them up after the process is finished. So we want to keep it into a nice, smooth consistency on the bottom of the pan, and keep it moving again so it doesn't burn. You can really kind of smell the raw flour as it's cooking, and you'll have that sensation go away here in just a couple minutes. Olfactory is part of cooking with any technique. You have to use your smells, you have to use your tastes, and you have to use, obviously, your sight to make sure that the final product is exactly what you want. But if you wanted to take a look back here at the roux, you're going to start to see bigger bubbles develop, and it almost starts to look like dough. So right now, basically, we're activating the gluten, which is a thickening agent. You're going to kind of see those striated marks, and it's almost going to look like a raw focaccia or a bread dough if you've ever made that before. We're not going to take it to that level, and if you were to bake this without yeast or a leavening agent, you would not get bread. But you're still going to see the striations happen there. That's going to help us thicken the sauce later, and that's what's going to give you almost the gravy consistency that we're going for with the final product. You can still smell a little bit of a rawness, but you're starting to get more of a toast, almost like a toasted bread or a toasted rice smell to it. And that's kind of what we're going for here. Again, you don't want to get too deep of color, because then it's going to start to develop more of kind of like a roasted almond flavor to it, or a nuttiness towards the end. And that's what we're trying to avoid, again, with kind of the delicate nature of everything that we're going to be putting in there, and the nuance with the cheese and the nutmeg to kind of finish everything out. At this point, we should have everything ready to go that we're going to be adding into this, because after this process and after you get the roux to where it needs to be, it goes fairly quick. So make sure you have your milk. I took the Gruyere cheese that we had, which is an Emmentaler from France. It's a very mild Gruyere. You can also use a Swiss. This is just going to kind of give more of a muted funkiness to it at the end, but not anything overpowering. It's going to add just that kind of decadent richness to the end, as you would expect from some more French-driven foods. So we have this all grated up on a fine grate. I would suggest, if you have a cheese grater, grating it right before you put it in, as opposed to buying it already pre-grated. Typically when you buy grated cheese, it's going to lose a lot of its moisture and going to be very dry towards the end, whereas I feel this is going to melt quite quickly into the base mornay that we're trying to make here. As you can see, the bubbles are starting to subside and get smaller as we continuously whisk it, as opposed to the nice airy bubbles, big bubbles that we saw before. This is telling me that it's really kind of starting to emulsify and come together. And I think we're about ready to go. Doesn't smell raw, it's starting to smell like a little bit of a toasted grain on the bottom here. So I'm going to add in our milk. You'll see that this will react again and open those bubbles up. We're obviously adding moisture to it. But at the end, this, you don't want to use cream because cream naturally will thicken itself and then become almost pasty. So we are using a whole milk. All right, so as you can see, after about 3 or 4 minutes, we've gotten to this nice consistency where it's almost nappe. It's almost holding to the whisk bristles themselves. This is where we really kind of want it. If you do need to thin out your base by any means, you can always add more milk or a little bit of water to kind of thin it down, but you do want it to be almost sauce consistency and have a nice sheen on top of it after we get through adding the milk to the base brew. You do want it to be a little thinner because we are going to add in the grated Gruyere cheese, which will thicken it and make sure right now, again to avoid lumps, just like we did with the roux, that you intermediately add in the cheese and continue to stir it. Again, when you do the fresh grated cheese, you're going to get a lot better of a melt on it because it's not so dry and it's not trying to rehydrate as it hits the fat that we're building down here. This will thicken it a little bit, of course, but it's more for flavor than anything. And we'll go ahead and add the rest of that in there. And now we're starting to get a little bit more of a viscous gravy style consistency to this whole thing, which if you've ever had a delicious pot pie, that's exactly what you're looking for on the inside. A nice little finish and flavor profile with creams and Swiss cheese or Gruyere is nutmeg and white pepper. So we have added the white pepper in, and we're going to finish it up with a little bit of nutmeg here to just give it a little bit of a roundness and just a final flavor profile. We didn't want to cook that into the flour because it burns very quickly. It's being so finely ground, but right now is a nice little finish. So we'll remove the whisk. We don't want to get all the spinach and the crabs stuck in the actual teeth of the whisk itself. So I'll use a wooden spoon at this point, but basically we're going to kill the heat because it's going to carry enough residual heat to heat up the filling as it stands. We're going to add this in there. Eventually we're going to get it all that we made incorporated. But again, we don't want it to clump up or anything, and we want it to be a nice thick pot pie stew because it's not going to thicken anymore once it's in the oven. But it will heat up and get to be nice and piping hot. You see there that it's nice and thick, ready to be put into the souffle cups and topped with our puff pastry. Now it's on to the dirty part, making the puff pastry tops. So again, making puff pastry is too much of a labor for love for most people, but they do sell quite good products wherever you go. You definitely want to look for one with sweet French butter. It's going to give you a nicer, more caramelized finish at the end. There are cheaper options out there, but this is one of the things I wouldn't skip on during the buying process. We're using Dufour here, and as you can see over here, we do have the filling that's still on the stovetop, just kind of resting, getting to room temperature so that we don't melt the puff pastry as we put it into the souffle dishes. So, all right, so for the puff pastry, typically they come a little thick. Meant for different ways, and you obviously can't thicken pastry, but you can thin it. So we want to kind of take the puff pastry as it stands widthwise down by about half for the whole process. It's going to facilitate the cooking process. It's going to make sure that the inside doesn't burn and kind of speed up the whole baking process when we get to the actual assembly of the pot pies. So for sanity of my house and clean surfaces, I wrap the counter in plastic wrap. We have a little extra AP flour here. We'll make sure that we get a little base down so that it doesn't stick to the plastic. So here we have our sheet of puff pastry. We'll make sure that that lives right on the flour so again we don't get any sticking later. We'll dust the top of it a little bit as well and make sure that you have your rolling pin ready to go. But once we get a nice little dust on top of here, we'll do the same thing with our wooden rolling pin, French rolling pin. And we'll just kind of, again, take the actual width of the puff pastry down by about half. Typically puff pastry will cook in about 20 to 25 minutes. And by doing this, we're shortening the cooking time for the finished product to about 13 to 15 minutes. But as long as we get kind of a nice, even, thin layer of puff pastry on top of there, it'll contribute to the crunch and the actual finish of the dish itself. So now that we have it thinned to where it needs to be, we'll grab our souffle cups to make sure that we know the diameter of what we're looking for. And when you're cutting the puff pastry, you want to make sure that the diameter of what you're cutting is a little larger than the souffle cups itself, because we would need to mount them on and around the sides. They really trap in that heat and get the rise out of the puff pastry that we're looking for. So in this instance, this was one of the mixing bowls I was using earlier, and it is slightly bigger in diameter than the souffle cup that we'll be presenting this in. So we're just going to put this down there. We'll take a little paring knife and just kind of go around the outsides. Cut your rounds and have them ready for when we fill the souffle cups, and we can just drop these on top and seal them around the edge. You don't need too much pressure with the knife on the puff pastry. It should slide right through there, but just do make sure that it's cut all the way through. And try not to put too much pressure from the bowl onto the puff pastry itself, or you'll get a little indentation that won't seal too well on the side of the souffle cups. Okay, now that we have our puff pastry tops finished and cut, and this has come down to less than a boil, we're going to start filling our souffle cups. We're not lining the bottom with any puff pastry. It's just going to be a topper for the whole dish, so there's no reason to put any Crisco or butter or any kind of oil or anything on the bottom of this. We're not trying to get it to release. We're going to eat it right out of the hot souffle cups when we're finished. So, make sure that you're filling the souffle cups all the way to the top. This will prevent the puff pastry from actually falling down. And again, I don't think you're going to get much rise from the filling as it bakes. But we do want to make sure that the puff pastry itself doesn't depress into the cup. We want it to rise up and be nice and presentable at the end. And after we get them all set up and ready to go, we're going to crumble some blue cheese in a couple of them and then top with puff pastry. All right, so we're going to add some Point Reyes blue cheese into these because I prefer the flavor profile. If you are going to choose a cheese and you can't find Point Reyes, make sure that it is a softer, more mild blue cheese. Some of the more fragrant blue cheeses are going to be overpowering again to all of the flavor, and this will absolutely carry a pungentness to it as well. And now to the assembly. We have all of our puff pastry rounds down here, so we can kind of get rid of the excess puff pastry. This is great if you do want to save it. In this instance, we're kind of just going to put it off to the side and figure out what to do with it later. But you have your rounds that should be bigger than the diameter of the souffle cups. And just make sure that you kind of use the insides of your hand. You don't want to puncture the puff pastry, but really kind of put some pressure on the rims here so it adheres to the side of the porcelain. And those are going to be our little puff pastry cups. So now that we have the tops on, you do want to make sure to vent the puff pastries. They will bake and they are going to get extremely hot inside. So we do want to kind of release the steam to allow the puff pastry to really kind of pop and the inside not to explode. We're going to take our brush, just a little bit of an egg with some water to kind of thin it down. Make sure that we get the whole top. You don't need an excess, and it doesn't need to be running off there. Just a little bit goes a long way for the puff pastry, so it doesn't end up being a drier flour-driven product and has a nice glaze to the top of it. And you should have your oven preheated at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Higher heat is going to get the caramelization on the puff pastry, and since we thinned it down, it doesn't need to really cook as much as it should in its normal state. So 425 for about 10 minutes is going to be just perfect. And if you have accessibility to it, I do like to put some flake salt on top just for an extra level of seasoning and a little crunch on the top as well. Sometimes people, when baking puff pastry, will use the excess puff pastry that they have. If they have cookie cutters and do little cutouts of what's in there, whether you have a fish or a crab or an artichoke or anything like that, it might be nice to decorate the top. But in this instance, we're just going to vent, brush, and we're going to go right into the oven at 425 for anywhere between 13 and 15 minutes. All right, I think we're good and ready to go. These have been baking at 425. I'd say the puff pastry is right where we need it to be. Nice and golden brown. You're gonna have a little bit of a crunch to it. It should be very flaky on top. We have a Spanish Albarino here. It's a nice crisp varietal that would pair really nicely with the cream and the crab and the artichokes and everything that's going to be inside of the pot pie itself. This is our recipe that we wanted to extend to you and yours for Valentine's Day. If making food at home and cooking is not up your alley, then we would love to have you at Del Mar Coastal Craft Cuisine and come see us down at Avanti for the Super Bowl or Valentine's this upcoming weekend. If not, we'll see you soon anyway. Thank you.